Hello. Our task today is to look at the work of Sigmund Freud, the psychologist who had such an epic influence on 20th century culture. We will focus specifically on what he says about religion. In this, we'll be following, as throughout this series, the presentation of Daniel Pals in his book, 9 Theories of Religion. If there's one idea that we can keep in mind as we approach the work of Sigmund Freud, it might be this. The human personality has depth. The human personality has depth. It's not a matter simply of conscious ideas, rational choices, decisions in the mind. Yeah, yes, we do all of that. But all of that is foisted upon, as it were, something deeper, something more irrational, something about which we are not entirely conscious. We'll be exploring this throughout the lecture and look at what it means for Freud's interpretation of religion. There are lots of questions raised today about Freud's work. Some of them are serious, scholars looking at how scientific his claims actually are, and some of them may be a bit less serious and have been around since the very beginning, people being affronted by his notion of the Oedipus complex, for example, that one wants to kill one's father and marry one's mother, and by marry it means have sex with, right? So there's something kind of I don't know, indecent about Freud's work. And if we think so today, we can join the legions of people over time who have thought that. But let's try and get at what is the lasting contribution of Freud's work, because I'll tell you, I'm convinced that there is. Sigmund Freud was born in 1856 and died in 1939. Quite a year to die, I've always thought. He lived almost all of his life in Vienna, in Austria. As I've suggested already, and as Pals puts it, he developed unsettling new analyses of the human personality. An analysis is when you take something apart and see how it's put together. So he looked at the human personality, at our self, at our mind, and uncovered new ways of talking about those things that many people found to be illuminating. As Pals writes here, Freud sought out the psychological dimension in almost every aspect of human life and felt he had found, or sometimes felt he had found, an explanatory golden key. A golden key. Why is the key golden? Because it fits every lock, right? You get the keys to the city, you get the golden key. This is, in fact, a criticism that's sometimes made about Freud's work. He has this theory, right? And then he just applies it to everything. So you can do a Freudian reading of X or of Y or of Z. And the question is, well, how much should we accept that kind of universal application of this theory? We'll get to that more at the end. Personally, his family was Jewish. Pals uses the word indifferent to characterize their connection with Judaism, although he suggests they did engage in some of the practice. Freud was never himself a religious Jew. He never had convictions along those lines, but it was an important part of his identity and certainly defined his position in the largely Catholic city of Vienna, Austria, where he lived. In 1881, he finished his doctorate in medicine, medical science, a practicing doctor, and he was focused on the conducting of brain research. So he started looking at the physical body. He didn't start as a psychologist, and really that notion of psychologists and psychology as a field was taking shape at this point. Freud was one of the people responsible for establishing that in our universities. He met a fellow named Joseph Breuer around this time, and in 1895 published a book that we're going to look at on the next slide about hysteria. Hysteria being a mental disorder with physical effects. So this study on hysteria with Breuer was the bridge for Freud from the physical to the mental. And of course, it is in the area of our psychic life that his impact has been most profound. The book I'm speaking about is Studies on Hysteria. You see that both Breuer and Freud are listed as authors here. Why is this book significant? I mean, we're trying to be pithy in our engagement with Freud, and I'm sure a lot of Freud scholars could take exception with the kind of summary treatment I'm going to be giving this book and everything here. But in this book, there's a particular case of a patient called Anna O. Not her real name, but she goes in the book by Anna O. What Freud did with Anna is talk to her. You could think of lots of different ways of trying to affect a person's mental disposition, electric shocks, or diet, or some kind of physical engagement, right? Freud doesn't do that with Anna O. He just talks to her. He listens. This is the idea on the couch. I'm on the couch with the psychologist, right? I'm going to lie back and I'm just going to engage in free associations, work back through word associations. Why? Because I want to get at an event in my past that is the cause of my present problem. I have some kind of problem. I'm depressed. I'm anxious. I'm, in this case of Anna O, hysterical, right? I'm having these physical symptoms. They're causing problems in my life. I go to see a doctor. How are we going to negotiate that? We're going to dig down together with the doctor, with the psychoanalyst, to identify what is causing these physical symptoms that's not itself simply physical. Freud develops this approach that comes to be known as the talking cure. And as Pals points out, this is much kind of mocked and criticized. I'm going to go pay a shrink $150 an hour, maybe in today's terms, to just listen to me and say, how do you feel about that, right? But that is indeed what Freud did, and this was not an instance of scandal. I mean, this was his effort to help the patient draw out these memories. In 1900, Freud publishes his findings, not specifically from the Anna O study, or maybe including that, but on this whole idea of the talking cure and drawing out these old memories and experiences, in a book called The Interpretation of Dreams. Pals calls this an epoch-making book. It happens right in the year 1900. In a lot of ways, this symbolizes the move from the 19th century into the 20th, if we could help ourselves to such an image. The book introduces these depths that I've been talking about, and the 20th century, intellectually speaking, will largely be engaged with working out what that's all about and how to understand those depths. Freud isn't doing this all by himself. Of course, he's working with Breuer, but he also assembles others in Vienna, forming the Vienna Psychological Society. Among those are Carl Jung and others named by Pals. Many of them go on to have students of their own, and this is a very influential moment in the history of psychology. Also in this period, as we'll see in upcoming slides, he turns to a focus on sexuality and the specific ways in which that can be repressed in a person's consciousness. Let's get to that idea of repression. So, okay, what do we mean by that? Let's go back to Tyler, E.B. Tyler, whom we talked about in our last video. Tyler had focused on dreams, you remember, and he had said the fact that we have dreams is evidence that we have, or is taken as evidence by primitive peoples, that we have some kind of soul or spirit, right? So even though I'm not physically awake, I'm having these experiences. Freud is reading Tyler, first of all. I mean, everybody's reading Tyler. He's a very influential person at this time. And he accepts, dreams are really important. But he goes farther than Tyler, right? Because for Tyler, the business about dreams is an explanation of why primitive peoples might have believed in a soul or a spirit, kind of the origins of religion, as we saw last time. For Freud, dreams continue to be important, right? So the dynamics that he's looking at are not particular to primitive societies, and then we'll just kind of leave those behind. He's looking at dynamics that he believes to be present in all human societies in all times because we are human. As Pals writes, dreams show just how much more there is to the activity of the mind than what appears on the surface. Now we're getting to these depths, right? When we have a dream, something is coming up in us, and we're experiencing that. Freud famously distinguishes among three levels of personality: the conscious mind, the preconscious mind, and the unconscious mind, right? So when I wake up in the morning, I look at my to-do list. That's my conscious mind, right? I'm making a plan, I'm setting things up, pursuing projects. Pre-conscious mind, I'm looking at memories that I have, maybe something that happened last week. It's not deep in me. I don't have it in the forefront of my mind, right? I could remember it though. Our unconscious mind, however, is something about which we are precisely unconscious. We don't know it's there. We're not aware of it, right? But it is as active as the conscious mind or the preconscious mind. Pals characterizes the unconscious as follows. It is our most basic physical urges, our desires for food and sexual activity, an assemblage of ideas, impressions, emotions associated with everything a person has ever experienced or done or wished to do, right? Everything that has happened in our psychic life gets stored, as it were, in this repository of the unconscious. The talking cure that we've already referred to is thus a process of bringing up things from the unconscious into the conscious mind in order to work on them, right? In order to shift around the contents of that unconscious so that they will have a less adverse effect on our day-to-day life. I have an image on the slide of a basement staircase, right? And that's an image that Pal suggests for the unconscious, that just as a house has upper rooms that are adorned and decorated and neat and bright, there's also perhaps a basement where you store things, where you just, stuff you don't know what to do with. You drop it down there. And that basement is a good image for Freud's notion of the unconscious. So memories are sinking from the conscious mind through the preconscious mind down into the unconscious. Now, sometimes that happens in a kind of natural way. You just forget something. Oh, yeah, I remember that happened, right? Other times, that happens by an act of repression. You suffer a traumatic experience, right? Something happens. You can't deal with it. I can't process this, right? You put it in the basement. You push it down. You don't want to deal with it. And that, Freud thinks, repression, that he thinks is where neurosis comes from, right? And that's our second point. Pals, repressed thoughts and emotions release themselves in forms of action that no rational person would engage in. I'm washing my hands. I have a nervous tic. I can't control myself. I'm having problems with managing my time or something like that. Why? It's not just a failure of my conscious will, right? It's a dynamic connected with these deeper things. This happens sometimes, the phrase maybe a Freudian slip, right? If somebody is talking about something and then, very often it would be like a reference to sex or something like this, something that you wouldn't usually bring up in day-to-day conversation. When that pops up, and I don't consciously mean for it to, that's why it's called a Freudian slip. It's something from that basement, boop, coming up into the consciousness. Another place where this happens, Freud thinks, is in dreams. He uses the notion of wish fulfillment to characterize that. So in that unconscious, I have all these wishes, these desires, these things that I would like to happen, maybe of which I'm not even entirely conscious. Well, many of which, by definition, I'm not, right? But in dreams, they come up and I experience them. As Pals writes, the unconscious is the crucial link between what is physical and what is mental in the human person. If you've studied some philosophy, you might have read the work of René Descartes, author of the Meditations on First Philosophy, among many other works. One of the problems for Descartes is the connection between the mind and the body, right? Okay, he says we have a soul, we have a mind, it's independent of the body in some way, but how are the two related? He has some kind of strange theories about that. Freud is purporting to explain it, right? Your physical drives, sex, hunger, anger, this kind of thing, are present in that unconscious, and then they can be repressed down further in there, or they can be pulled up, or they can manifest in certain ways. Here's an image that's often used to describe or to illustrate this relationship. Think about an iceberg, right? So iceberg, you got a whole hulking bunch of it down under the water. In fact, far more is under the water than is on top of the water, right? So in my day-to-day life, I maybe have, 10 things I want to do on a certain day on my to-do list. I do have a to-do list. But that's pretty minimal compared to the whole sum total of my memories and experience and life to date. What we reveal, the creator of this image, thank you, has marked in association here with the conscious mind, but then what we conceal down below, right? Because not only maybe we're not aware of something in the unconscious, we may not want to be aware of it. And that's what repression is. We're precisely trying not to think about it. We might want to hide that from others, right? And Freud, again, going back to that main idea, there are depths in the human personality. There is also conflict in the human personality. So in addition to this notion of levels, right, and each of those levels are dynamically interacting with each other, Freud focuses on the notion of drives, in German Trieb, right? These drives, he thinks, move things down into the unconscious through repression, pull them back up out of the unconscious in moments in which we're expressing our desires. He goes through, as Pals discusses, a few different stages in how he kind of like defines what these drives are, but he settles on love and death, or if you like, sex and death, right? Hence the illustration on the slide. On the one hand, we want to build up, nurture, join, create, right? And on the other, we have this contrary impulse to destroy, to take apart, to challenge, to undo things. And he thinks that these two drives are constantly just grating against each other, and they serve to move things, again, up and down through those levels. This is an unavoidable tension. The self, right? The self is not just the tip of the iceberg, right? It's not just the upstairs with the nice furniture. The self is all of it, right? And this is an important and well-known aspect of Freud's theory that we need also to focus on, his threefold account of the personality. So we've talked about the kind of conscious, preconscious, unconscious mind, right? But Freud uses other language that's helpful in the same way. He refers to the id, the ego, and the superego. These are words simply taken from Latin. Id is just Latin for id, for it, for our English it. Ego in Latin simply means I. It's the first person pronoun. And the superego, super means above. So this is the I above, right? So these are not mysterious terms. As Pals puts it helpfully in each case, the id, what we are as a thing, right? As an object, an animal, right? Maybe the raw physical drives of the body, and in our id, these raw physical drives are transformed, I think, translated into wishes, right? So I want sexual satisfaction, and I form a wish to have sexual satisfaction with a certain person, right? That's on the level of the id, right? I'm not even consciously choosing to do that. It's like, those are my feelings, you'd say, right? I can't do anything about my feelings. Well, Freud says you can go to psychotherapy, but I'll skip to the third one, because the id is coming from below, as it were. Those are our kind of base drives, but the superego is coming from above, right? These are societal expectations, ideals, principles, things we hold to, right? Things that we regard as being higher than ourselves. In between these two, the drives and the expectations, there is the ego, right? I, me, the conscious mind. And what that ego is doing is balancing between, okay, I have these physical drives, right? And I like to satisfy them, but there are these principles as well, right? There are these things that are telling me that it's wrong to do so, right? So how do I kind of choose between those two? And Pals refers to it as a choosing center. Freud also refers to it as a reality principle, right? I mean, if we were to simply satisfy all of our physical drives all the time, we would not do very well in reality. We probably wouldn't even last very long, right? Or if we were to simply always, follow every expectation and never satisfy any of our physical needs or desires, also we would not do well. So the ego is engaged with, practical negotiation with reality, and it's trying to balance those two things. Here we have another image back to the iceberg, but it's associating these three, the ego, the superego, and the id, with the conscious, the preconscious, and the unconscious. The creator of this image, again, thanks to the creator of this image, helpfully frames it. The ego is an executive power mediating between the id impulses and superego inhibitions. It tests reality. It's rational, right? It operates mainly at the conscious level. The superego, ideals and morals, striving for perfection, right? Incorporated from your parents, and this is referring to your conscious, right? So you know that you have certain values, certain principles, you're pursuing certain higher kind of goals. You don't always have it fully in mind consciously, but it's preconscious, it's there, it's not repressed or buried. You can call it up easily enough. But then there's this id deeper down, basic impulses, sex, aggression. It seeks immediate gratification, it's irrational, and it's impulsive, right? Another image, a traditional one associated with this, is from Plato. Plato's chariot, thanks to the creator of this image as well, it seems to be very nicely hand drawn. In one of his dialogues, Plato describes the soul as having three parts: reason, emotion or passion, and desire. And the reason here would correspond to the ego, right? Emotion with the superego, and desire with the id. What reason is doing is driving the two horses, right, forward, trying to keep them on track. The horses are driving the chariot. Like, the chariot doesn't move without the horses. You need emotion and desire, but you also need reason to guide it. One of the notions for which Freud is best known is this idea of the Oedipus complex. This is, in a way, it was received as a very scandalous idea when he developed it. Pals phrases it well. This is the stunning idea, or it's connected to the broader stunning idea, that early childhood, no less than adult life, is strongly shaped by the sexual desires of the id. So we've talked about the depths, we've talked about the levels. Down at the bottom, the unconscious, the id, right, driving us. This doesn't just happen after puberty, right? This happens from the moment a human being is born. This is what was seen as so scandalous about it. So, children are innocent. Infants, babies, for God's sake, right? You're telling me that an infant has sexual desire? Freud says yes. To be human is to be driven by those two horses, right? It's to have your reason controlling those two. And so at all stages of human development, that deeper dimension is functioning. He identifies oral, anal, and genital phases. And as the infant develops, each of these phases kind of overlays the one before. You never lose the earlier phases, but they remain kind of, again, repressed or inactive in your unconscious. The let's see, the oral, anal, and genital phases. The term anal retentive is a term that you might have heard for somebody who likes to have everything just so, in her space. Such a person, or they're so anal, right? That's a Freudian reference. It means that person has not successfully incorporated the anal stage of their infantile development in a way that fits with the needs of their adult life. This is, to return to our earlier term, a neurosis, right? So if a person's really obsessive about everything being exactly so, you could say, oh, you're so neurotic, right? Pals, in the phallic stage, we're getting to the Oedipus complex here, we experience a desire to displace one parent and become the lover of the other. Freud had translated Sophocles' famous tragedy, Oedipus, into German as a schoolboy, Pals points out. So he had this drama from Sophocles, the tragedy, in mind. What happens in that drama? There's a mother and father. They have a child, and there's a prophecy that the child is going to kill the father and marry the mother. The mother and father are so horrified by this that they send the child away to a distant country where the child Oedipus grows up. Oedipus one day is out roving, doing what people of the time did, and engages in combat with a troop of people. Turns out that at the head of that other troop of people is his father. He doesn't know that the person is his father, and he does kill his father. He returns to his father's city and marries his mother, marries the queen. And so, in a frightful way, even though this prophecy was known, even though steps were taken to avoid this, Oedipus fulfills the prophecy, quite despite himself. And when he realizes he does so, as you see on the image on the slide here, he tears out his eyes. It's a stunning image. What Freud thinks is that once the infant moves through the oral and the anal, gets to the phallic stage or the genital stage, the infant or child does experience just that. They're working out their desires, right? They decide that the father figure is the authority, is kind of a superego, right? Is preventing them from realizing their desires. And so they form a desire to kill that father, to eliminate that higher, standard, and to fulfill their desires, their sexual desires with the mother. Here again, you also have sex and death, the two primary drives. As Pals writes, for Freud, the Oedipus complex is the central experience of the years of childhood, the greatest problem of early life, and the main source of later inadequacy. And I realize actually that's a quote from Freud in Pals. Let's turn to Freud and religion. Let's review too. Where have we been? We've seen that for Freud, the personality has depths: the conscious, the preconscious, the unconscious, the ego, the superego, and the id. We have these drives, sex and death, that move us through these two, that lead us to move our memories and experiences through these different levels. He takes this picture, the kind of broad picture of Freudian thinking, and applies it to religion. Religion, he says, is the universal obsessional neurosis of humanity. The universal obsessional neurosis of humanity. So just as an individual human being might repress stuff, right, or fail to integrate the different stages of their development, they become neurotic. They start doing weird things. Religion is a neurosis. It is a mental illness, right? Religion is a result of us failing to move past earlier stages of our development in a way that is appropriate for us as adults. The dynamic here, as I say on the slide, is similar to sexual repression. So just as we repress things, including sexuality, and this causes problems in our day-to-day life, in religion, we repress things, and this causes us to seek an outlet in the practice of religion. Here, as elsewhere, Freud is thinking about Tyler again, but also Fraser. He agrees with them. Religious beliefs are untrue to begin with, right? They are superstitions, but Freud thinks that they're interesting superstitions, and he's a little different from Tyler and Fraser in that. Whereas Tyler and Fraser are criticizing these irrational beliefs and saying we need to be rational. We need to consciously move past these false beliefs in religion. Freud says, well, yeah, we need to move past them, but how we move past them is going to engage that whole picture of ourself, the whole picture of the multiple layers of our personality. They're interesting because through the different practices of religion, we see revealed what is actually hidden in people. We're able to psychoanalyze them by watching how they practice or how they, let's say, engage in religious behavior. And to the next point, this behavior for Freud always resembles a mental illness. So if you want to study religion for Freud, you don't, just read the Bible or learn about sacred texts or, observe practices from a sociological point of view or whatever. You need to look at them from a psychoanalytic point of view. You need to understand what drives them and why they are happening as they do. There are 3 books in which Freud engages with religion directly. I'm going to say just a little bit about each of them. The first one was published in 1913 under the title Totem and Taboo. This book is looking back at primitive peoples. Remember Tyler's book, Primitive Culture, right? So Freud is reading Tyler. He's building on that intellectual space. Like Tyler and Fraser, he is interested in this idea of animal totems and the custom of taboos, right? So a totem, remember, is an animal or a plant that kind of represents the tribe, has a special privileged status. The taboo is something that you must not do. So incest is the standard kind of example of a taboo, something that even in our modern society we regard as frightful. And not only because of a rational understanding that genetic deformities can result from the relation between 2 persons of the same background, but because we find it somehow abhorrent or disgusting. And for Freud, you need to understand why that is so. He tries to do so in the case of these earlier peoples. Beyond Tyler and Fraser, he's not only saying that these things happened or trying to understand them in the past. He wants to explain why these things continue into his time in the 20th century, and we could say also the 21st century. Why do people, if they know that these things are irrational? I don't know, I go to a game or something. I know it's silly to be excited about the mascot of my team and be yelling and calling out and that kind of thing. But I do it anyway, and I like it, right? And if so, why are we doing this? For Freud, the cause is psychic ambivalence. So you know that what you're doing is kind of silly, kind of irrational, right? But you do it anyway because you want to do it, right? You're fulfilling those desires in your unconscious mind. And in the book, he traces how that dynamic from the past continues into the present. In the next book, and this is his main work on religion, The Future of an Illusion, we'll have a selection from that as well this week in class. He looks not to the past, but to the future. So he starts from kind of where we were in 1927 and considers what is happening with religion in the future. He starts from, as Pals helpfully puts it, a couple of facts, right? He's trying to map out the dynamics of religion and why people are religious. We join in communities for protection from the natural world, paraphrasing Pals. But we know that the forces of that world, decay and death, will prevail. Why don't we all just live alone in the forest, right? It's better to live together. We support each other, share resources, all the rest. But in the same way, we are constantly threatened, even in those communities, by decay and death. And for Freud, I mean, there's no kind of resurrection or anything like this. Those are going to prevail. You are going to die, and your body is going to decay. So you know that rationally, it's hopeless. However, you can develop, in addition to joining these communities, it's kind of a limited stopgap, you can develop a greater stopgap, which is a belief in a loving Father, a God, a personal God, who will protect you, right? Even though your body will decay and die, even though you will face loss and suffer throughout your life, you can take comfort from the knowledge that you are beloved of God. He thinks that this illusion is something that we retreat to. We look back to our childhood at a time when, for many of us, one hopes, we had a father figure who was strong and protecting, or at least we wanted one, right? And we return to that as a way of coping with the present. Religion, he says, he makes a distinction here between an illusion and a delusion. It's an illusion. I want it to be true, right? I don't know for sure if it's true or not true. Like Pal says, I want to be great, or I want to be famous, right? And maybe I have an illusion that I will be those things. It may or may not happen. It's different from a delusion. I mean, if I say I'm 12 feet tall, if I really believed that, I would be deluded. Freud isn't saying that religion is a delusion. He's saying it is, returning to the idea about dreams before, a wish fulfillment. We wish not to die and decay, and so we find a belief that enables us to believe that we won't, right? It's helpful, makes us comfortable. A little passage from Pals here that I think nicely encapsulates what Freud is saying in this book. Religious beliefs, Pals writes, may have been of some small assistance in the growth of civilization, but civilization is now mature and established. We would no more want to build today's society on such superstition and repression than we would want to force grown men and women to obey the rules of behavior we lay down for children. When there is a failure to overcome the traumas and repression of earlier life, psychoanalysis knows that the personality is in disorder. The same is true for the growth of civilization. Religion that persists into the present age of human history can only be a sign of illness. So here again we see this analogy that Freud is drawing between the individual case, so I have certain experiences, I go through certain stages of development and so forth as an individual, and the social case, right? So just as the individual develops over time, so too do societies. Just as the individual can fail to develop in a healthy way, right? Can fail to integrate one of those stages, can fail to negotiate between the id and the superego and end up in a mess, right? So too can societies. The persistence of religion for Freud is an example of a failure to recognize, because of that ambivalence, right? A failure to recognize that these superstitious beliefs are untrue, and a failure to kind of face squarely the fact of decay and death, the fact that, yes, that is in fact our destiny. His last book, I want to just comment on briefly because Pals talks about it, and it is his third important book on religion. I've always thought this is such a strange book, and I'm sure that scholars of Freud could correct me on that, and I hope you would. As Pals writes in this book, Freud focused his attention on the figure of Moses, examining his foundational role in Jewish life and thought. He proposes an extraordinary retelling of Jewish history, of Hebrew history, and he walks through Pal some of the details of this. There was a figure named Moses who actually did liberate the people of Israel from their slavery in Egypt. They walked through the desert, but then Freud adds the detail that these people became dissatisfied with Moses and they killed Moses, and they began to worship this alternative God, right? And this alternative God led them to engage in all of these martial conquests to take the promised land, and then the prophets, Amos and Isaiah and Ezekiel, called them back to the worship of the true God, Yahweh, and a new leader emerged who came to be identified with the original Moses. Hard to believe stuff, and I don't know that it's much regarded by historians as reliable. However, it is a good illustration of Freud's thinking about religion and how he sees those dynamics between the father figure, the founder that we kill, and then like Oedipus, and then we feel guilty about killing the father figure, so we seek this atonement, right? I mean, even in Christianity, we kill Christ, we kill God, right? And then we're trying to atone for that in some way. Christians believe that, it contains its own atonement. That's a different lecture. As Pals writes here, Judaism, for Freud, recalls the urge to idealize the father and repress the guilt left behind by his murder to make him into a loving God. Christianity, moving forward, feels the same mix of affection and guilt, but responds by declaring the need for atonement. So he's looking at these real existing religious traditions and applying his theory to them. Just two more slides. I'm going to look at some of what Pal says in analysis and then some of the critiques that have been made against Freud's work. We are all Freudians now. first point made here by Pals. He's quoting W.H. Auden, the poet, writing in the early 20th century. What does that mean? We are all Freudians. Even if you don't know it, even if you didn't know anything about Freud before you listened to this lecture, you are convinced that there are hidden forces in the human personality. I will just tell you that. I don't know, maybe you're not. But the very idea that there is an unconscious, that repression is possible, that there are such things as neuroses or later, psychoses, that disorders are about the misalignment of different parts of the self. A lot of these details have been criticized by actual practicing psychologists today, and Freud's legacy is kind of tenuous at times. But in terms of establishing these things in the popular mind and laying the foundation for so much of 20th century culture, there's no question about Freud's influence. And then there is his explanation of religion. A quotation from Pals here. If we want to know why religion persists, even when it has been discredited by science or better philosophy, we need only turn to psychoanalysis, Freud thinks, which tells us quite clearly that the true source of religion's appeal is not the rational mind, but the unconscious. Right? We sometimes think about belief in God as, well, what are the reasons to believe in God? What proofs do we have? What evidence is there? Are there miracles or the testimony of the scriptures or whatever it is? For Freud, this is all beside the point. This is all just neurotic folk working out some, rationalization of deeper and ultimately irrational reasons for being religious. We are religious because we feel guilty, because we are obsessive about that feeling of guilt, and we want to feel released from decay and death. We want to feel released from that guilt, and we believe there is an agency, we call this agency God, who can do this for us. We would do better to put this aside. Pals uses the term functionalist reductionism to characterize Freud's work, and this is indeed a textbook case of it. It is a functionalist account of religion, as we've seen in earlier weeks, because it's defining religion in terms of how it works. What purpose does it serve? What is its function, right? So religion is a way of coping with our fear of decay and death and a way of managing our guilt, period, right? There are no deep philosophical questions to ask. There are no theological quandaries to explore. It's just doing something for you. It's also doing something for a society, right? It's a reductionist functionalism because it's not saying here is one way of explaining what religion does. It's saying this is what religion is. That's it, right? Like just, take your fractions and simplify them and you come down to just this, right? So, 4/8 is 1/2. That's just what it is. There's not some remainder. You don't have anything, richer or poetic or beautiful about the 4/8 as compared to the 1/2. The 4/8 is just a less efficient, less clear expression of something that, when understood clearly, is stated more simply. In terms of the critique of Freud's work, Pals emphasizes 4 distinct points. The first, Freud is really focused on this father figure business, right? Monotheism. So he wants to say that religion is driven by, you kill the father, Oedipus complex, you have guilt about this, you repress the guilt down into your unconscious, right? And then that bubbles up and becomes the practice of religion. What about religions where there is no single God or father figure, Hinduism or Buddhism, for example? What does Freud have to say about that? Not much, really, in any explicit way, but this has been a criticism of Freud from the beginning. Also, this business of analogy that we talked about before. Freud is a medical doctor who studies mental disorders, and then he, develops that pattern, the conscious, preconscious, unconscious, id, ego, superego, and maps out the human personality. But then he takes that and applies it to human societies and says, like, oh yeah, just like the individual is developing, so too is the society developing. That might be true. It also might be false. It's hard to say, and from a scientific point of view anyway, it's a bit dubious. There are also cases, like in Moses and Monotheism, where he's making claims that are historical claims, like things that did or did not happen, and it's kind of questionable whether they are justified. A third is circularity. Is he assuming the thing he wants to prove? Right? So it looks sometimes like, and this goes back to the beginning, the golden key image, right? It looks like Freud has this system, right? We outlined the system in this video, and then he just applies that to everything, right? So I can do a Freudian reading of this, a Freudian reading of that. And the question is he actually assuming all of the parts of that system and then just plugging it in to this and this and this? If so, his argument might be circular, right? Because if you assume that Anna O is suffering from repression of some kind, and then you find repression, you shouldn't be surprised about that. And you're not necessarily even learning anything new. You're just seeing how a theory applies to a case. And finally, is this question about psychoanalysis as a science. I am not a practicing psychologist. I'm a scholar of religion, and talk to any practicing psychologist, and they might have some critical words about Freud's legacy. As we've said, it's very important in culture and history of the 20th century. However, from a clinical point of view at present, it might be of limited use. And the last point I would make about that is this notion of falsifiability. Falsifiability. If a theory cannot be proven wrong, like how do I prove that there is no unconscious? How do I prove that there's a superego and an id being, managed by an ego? I don't know. It's almost like poetry. It's an image, right? I find it inspiring or helpful or interesting. I can make arguments on its basis, but is it scientific? I mean, can I actually do an experiment and find out, oh, darn, we don't have a superego after all? Karl Popper, the philosopher of science in the 20th century, singled out Freud as an example of a person who was developing a theory that Popper regarded as unscientific. And so, friends, thank you very much. Sigmund Freud, psychologist from Vienna, developing this intricate system and teaching us that in ourselves, in the human personality, there are indeed depths, a lasting contribution from this thinker. Next week, Emil Durkheim.